VALKYRIA Revolution Review. Revolution is such a nice, punchy word. Generally, it's even a positive word, or so we're generally led to think as we're on the right side of a bevy of revolutions ranging from the American to the sexual. But let's be honest, change isn't always good. However noble intentions may be, sometimes the revolution ends up making things worse than they were before. And that, sadly, appears to be what happened with Valkyria Revolution. In a wider sense, the revolution here would be the act of yanking the Valkyria series away from its tactical origins in order to create something that's better described as a Dynasty Warriors-style RPG. The approach never works quite as well as it should. Valkyria Revolution has a rather fascinating narrative premise as its foundation, but all developer media vision builds on it are overlong, weakly animated cutscenes with frequent loading screens and a merely moderately enjoyable combat system. It's possible its weaknesses grew out of the need to make Valkyria Revolution less graphically intensive to accommodate a simultaneous release on the Vita, but the approach makes the PS4 version I played suffer greatly for it. In outline, at least, the story's fascinating. It takes place in an alternate timeline from the Valkyria Chronicles series proper, which more on that later. This, appropriately, is the tale of the tiny nation of Jutland's revolution for independence from the Russian Empire Red Russia, and it's framed as a conversation between a student and his professor a century in the future. The professor tells the true story of war as opposed to the version that's been accepted by history, and it cleverly lets you revisit old cutscenes by looking through the professor's scrapbook. The revolution clearly worked out well for Jutland, but this prosperity grew out of the schemes of the so-called five traitors who orchestrated world events partly out of simple revenge for injustices suffered at their orphanage when they were young. The problem, then, is not so much the content of the story but how it's told. Valkyria Revolution often feels as though it's 3/4 painfully bad cutscenes and 1/4 gameplay. Some of these cutscenes drag on for as long as 15 minutes, but only rarely does the action rise above watching a bunch of characters standing around a table with nothing moving but their mouths. Often you won't even see the speakers speaking as the camera's pointed at the back of their heads, as though to save on even that degree of animation. Also, you either have to sit through the whole cutscene or skip it entirely. There's no option to skip over lines of dialogue if you've read the subtitles faster than the character speaks them. Adding insult to injury, an endless parade of short loading screens interrupts the flow as one cutscene transitions to another. All while the characters are spouting politics that sounds as though it was ripped from accounts of Europe on the verge of the First World War or Bismarck-era Germany. Even as a degree-holding historian, I found the presentation often couldn't hold my attention, and I find this especially shameful since Valkyria Chronicles' somewhat realistic World War II elements were so appealing. The action-oriented combat doesn't do much to make up for it. It has its moments, particularly when you jump into the midst of an enemy bunch of soldiers with Amleth, he of the Imitation Buster's sword, and cut them all down in one tidy swing. And generally, I'm a person who prefers big swords to big guns. But gosh, it's repetitive. Regardless of whether I'm in many story missions or in the free missions, I too often found myself grinding for stay strong enough to handle the story missions. But there's very little in the way of variation. It's always about jumping into maps with often low-resolution textures, plowing through a bunch of bad guys, and then beating the boss. The ability to switch between up to 4 squadmates of different classes makes battles a little more interesting, as do the flashy animations that contrast so starkly with the stodginess of the cutscenes. Yet outside of those moments you start to see the many other flaws, such as the way sidearms like rifles feel almost worthless compared to the big melee weapons wielded by the heroes. The AI can be moronic, with squadmates outright ignoring collective orders or running off to fight distant enemies. As for the enemies themselves, each new one rarely looks much different from the last, and they all stand around waiting for you to hit them. In appearance and in action, the setup reminds me of nothing so much as the enemies in the MMORPG Star Wars, The Old Republic. Magic was in short supply in Valkyria Chronicles, but here it's everywhere. After all, the reason the Russian Empire wants Jutland in the first place is that the Jewish folk have a massive stash of Ragnite, the substance that powers all this magic. The resulting spells add spice to the combat with fireballs or causing tremors to erupt beneath enemies' feet. and Revolution tries to wedge in a dash of Chronicles tactical combat by forcing you to press the triangle button every time you use them to stop combat. Like so much about Revolution, it's a nice touch in theory, but the constant juggling ruins the flow of combat. On top of that, an emotional combat system attempts to add depth by lowering enemy defenses by striking fear into them with swift surprise attacks, but it rarely seems beneficial enough to warrant tactical consideration. Valkyria Revolution drowns in this shallowness. Unlike Valkyria Chronicles, there's little to distinguish it from the massive generic Japanese RPGs already available, and at times it almost comes off as a parody. It's entertaining enough, partly thanks to the broad strokes of its story, but it's also eminently forgettable. So much of what made the Valkyria series great, the cel-shaded, hand-drawn art style, and the roughly realistic world where magic feels almost as otherworldly as it would in our own, gets cast aside in favor of 3D models that would look more at home in Star Ocean. And magic that's as common as booze in a fray house. It's a revolution that's better read about than experienced. Valkyria Revolution tells a decent tale of war, but the strength of that story is dulled by overlong, boring, and poorly animated cutscenes. It sacrifices the unique historical setting and art style of the Valkyria Chronicles series proper in favor of generic JRPG elements that fail to leave a strong impression, and its hack-and-slash combat offers little in the way of strategy and ruins its own flow with an poorly matched magic system.